name is Ntombizikhona Valela, and I am a historian and a writer. Well, I'm a historian, and I am from the Eastern Cape, a small town called King Williamstown, and just a space where kind of is significant to, the kind of person I am in terms of the profession that I am kind of crafting out for myself. The Eastern Cape was a very crucial landscape in the formation of South Africa as we know it today. It was a crucial landscape of resistance against dispossession, among many other landscapes in the country. And I think the work that I do kind of, in some ways, tries to, through unearthing that, is a way of resisting, is a way of writing back and speaking truth to power. And I'm also just a young woman who really is interested in all things pop culture and using my skills to kind of bridge the gap between the academic and the social spaces in order to make information accessible to everybody in a language that is not intimidating and that rids of itself of jargon that is just, that tends to sort of intimidate people from accessing information that I think is necessary for the kind of space that we are in historically. There's a lot missing. I think there's not enough that we are telling. And I think what is currently there, what you find in the archive it is sexist, and I think it is also it marginalizes a lot of ordinary people's accounts of what they experienced, and which is very important in terms of how we reflect on what we've just come out of. I mean, as we have this conversation right now, we're speaking in a year that marks the 60th anniversary, most of Africa's independence. It marks the 30th anniversary of Madiba's release, which marked, a period of transition. But within that period, while that is documented, if we speak about Madiba, for example, within that period is a lot of information, a lot of stories about trauma that is barely documented. There's this very romantic idea of what we've survived, and yet it's littered in the blood of innocent people. It's littered in the blood of people who sacrificed a lot for what we have, for us to be able to even have this conversation that we're having right now. And those stories are barely told. Perhaps because there is maybe an agenda to kind of whitewash what we've been through, and to also not hold perpetrators of violence and brutality accountable, and to not actually, maybe, I think if we had a full history, a full picture of what we've been through, perhaps there would be more things that we maybe demand as a people with greater urgency and with a very increased intensity, in our demands for change. Because this is not to say that no one's actually doing that, but I think if we were really aware as a collective of what we've survived, I think the intensity with which we demand change would probably be far higher than what it is currently. One thing that I appreciate about South African audiences as it relates to jazz is I think there's a lot of appreciation and recognition of the contributions of a number of individuals, including Sathima. But the problem is, and I think this is something that I feel we don't dive deeply enough into, is the acknowledgement of the composition work that these people do. So we know about them, and yes, as you say, this is somebody who is predominantly known as somebody who introduced Abdullah Ibrahim to Duke Ellington. It's a typical case of erasure, specifically of women. But I do think that also there is an erasure not just of women in terms of the work that they've done, in terms of the albums that they've put out, the songs that they've put out, but I think also in the creation process and in the ways that women, specifically in this case, have kind of shaped what we now know and understand to be, South African jazz. And I could add even someone who is so widely known like Miriam Makeba. We talk a lot about her life, and her life is definitely remarkable. There's a lot that is documented about where she had lived and so on, and how she had lived almost, a dispossessed type of individual, a nomadic type of individual as a result of exile and so on. But we don't really talk deeply, especially in the public sphere, about how she contributed to shaping how we hear and appreciate South African jazz music, how she infuses South African jazz with traditional sounds, with a traditional style of singing, how she adds those kinds of vocabulary to the broader lexicon of South African jazz. We don't talk about that. We will definitely go deep into how Hugh Masekela did those things as a composer. We'll dive deep into, his thought process and how he arranged his specific music. We don't do that about someone like Dorothy Masuka. We don't do that with someone like Dolly Ratebe. We kind of remember these women specifically as just people who simply sang the compositions, who simply conveyed the message of the songs, and not necessarily people who are architects of a genre and architects of, of a particular type of arrangement and the ways in which we sing music and hear music today. And they definitely contributed immensely. Someone like Sathima, her voice is I think something that is yet to be deeply studied, and we've yet to sort of deconstruct her imprint in jazz music in the ways that we do someone like Abdullah Ibrahim. And I think it's kind of similar to someone like Alice Coltrane, how for many years she was just seen as this widow of John Coltrane, and yet there are many, instances that we can bring out about that particular history of that couple in which Alice Coltrane influenced her husband, and especially within the realm of spirituality, and how then he used that to kind of create the kinds of music that he ended up doing. So I think in South Africa, I personally feel that there's definitely a greater appreciation of our artists in terms of excavating their archive and the things that they have contributed musically. But I think we've yet to dive deep into the project of elevating the work of certain artists and their contribution to composition, their contribution to shaping genre into what it is today. Because when you think about someone like Makeba, for example, there is no Thandiswa Mazwai, there is no Zoe Mudikha, there is no Siama Khuzeni, there's none of the contemporary women, there's no Busi Mhlongo, there's no Letta Mulu without her. And the ways in which she kind of married two different styles of music as part of, constructing what we now know and appreciate to be the genre that we're discussing today. It's something that's quite similar to when we think about someone like Steve Biko. Now, for the longest time, he was never really considered a philosopher, even though Black consciousness is a philosophy. For a long time, he was not considered to occupy that prestigious title of philosopher in the way that Hegel and Marx and the like are. And I think it has a lot to do with, and if we talk about it in terms of the music, it has a lot to do with the fact that African people are often considered at the margins of cultural architecture, if I can put it that way. That there is simply no way, no possibility that Black people can create something, and that they can influence culture, that they can influence the way we listen and appreciate music. And there's also a savior mentality, a white savior mentality when it comes to the work and the creative output of Black people. You know, there's this idea that I think there's this thing that we notice about certain, you know, academics who kind of, they Columbus our work when it's always been there, when it's always existed and has existed freely outside of the white gaze. But I think because academia remains a very untransformed space, and even writing in the public sphere, like just look at who writes most of the time. Up until very recently, I think, you know, in the past 3-4 years, I've seen far more writing and archiving of our artists from Black men and women. Before that, it wasn't writing by us. It wasn't appreciation of this work by us. And therefore, you know, and I believe personally that only Black people can actually really fully articulate what's being said, because this work is ours. This is work that we've created. This is work that we understand. It's spoken in a language and texture and timbre that we understand. And if you are going to write about that as someone who is a non-Black person, you kind of have to unshackle yourself of any colonial notions of who we are and how we create and how we appreciate our artistic output. I think that's probably one of the ways that one can actually truly write from a space where, as a Black reader, one can be able to say, if your audience is going to be universal such that it includes the Black reader, you have to unshackle yourself as a non-Black person from all these anthropological, you know, colonial ideas of what our music and our art is. And I think that's why, you know, when you ask that question, you know, I can sense that frustration, you know, of being a reader and kind of trying to engage with a work. It doesn't actually speak to anything that is actually a reality of where the artist and the subject of that work was coming from when they created that work. And I think it's because of all these hang-ups, these colonial hang-ups and racist hang-ups that people want to cling to, because I think in pop culture there is this idea that there's certain music that is the standard and everything else needs to sort of catch up or isn't music if it does not fulfill certain standards. So I guess that's why people like your No Finish Julies and Princess Magogos and so on are kind of read in a way that is almost pathologized in a way, yeah. So for me, one of the things that history and the study of history has kind of gifted me with is just this open space. While one is looking back, I think there's so many things about where we come from as a people that show you that there's just this open space of possibility of things that we as a people can accomplish, of loose ends that are yet to be tied in terms of our freedom. And I think that the work that I do, you know, that work of uncovering that which has been ignored and erased in terms of the work that specifically, because my focus definitely deals with and deliberately deals with, you know, the erasure of women in our archive. And not just erasure in terms of the fact that they're not spoken about, but even in the ways that they are spoken about is a form of erasure. So the work that I do is about bringing that out. And I think there's something really inspiring about knowing that there are people who come before you who are a people of great dignity and are nothing like what we are sometimes conditioned to believe that they were, that they have contributed so much immensely in the world as we know it. In the public space, when I write, I definitely, you know, I focus a lot on the work of Black people in the pop culture space, and to know that, and so to uncover the stories of Black people within classical music, and that they were innovating in that space as much as they are innovating in jazz music, as they are innovating in hip hop and so on, I think is my bit in correcting what has been an injustice, you know, in terms of how we have been sort of misrepresented in the ways in which we've been misrepresented historically. And I think also I've come to realize, just bringing that knowledge into a space like social media, it makes you realize how much people are longing for this information, and how reading up on this and, sort of getting, even if it's just a summarized idea of who certain people were and what difference they made to society. I think there's something about that kind of assists in making one walk a little bit taller. I think when I read this work and see that there are certain people making immense differences in people's lives, it kind of gives me the permission to be a little prouder of myself and prouder of my community. And it also is an important challenge of the work that can be done, because we live in a time where we're privileged with technology and all sorts of resources at our disposal. We can connect much faster with the world. And if they could do it at a time where there were so many limitations, if someone like Sathima Benjamin, as much as she has been erased, but still has done great work in archiving someone like Winnie Mandela through music, how much more can we achieve in a world that has, advanced a little bit further, than when she was a young person, creating the work that she was creating. And I think also considering, what jazz is a space, is an archival space. A lot of our artists have kind of in a lot of ways used that music to make history and used it as a space where one can look in to what we were and what we are and what we could be. And I think in my role as a historian, I'm grateful for that space because it kind of helps me do my job a little bit better.